There are civilizations that end in fire, in sudden catastrophe, in walls breached and cities put to the torch. And then there are civilizations that end slowly, almost imperceptibly, like light fading from a summer sky, so gradual that no single moment marks the transition from day to twilight, from twilight to darkness. Egypt's ending was like that. By the time Alexander the Great entered the Delta in 332 BCE, Egypt had already been ruled by foreigners for generations. The Persians had come and gone and come again. The native dynasties that had briefly reclaimed power had fought and failed. The temples still stood, the priests still chanted, the river still flooded each year with mathematical precision. But something had shifted. Some center of gravity had moved, quietly, without announcement. The age when Egypt shaped the world around it, when pharaohs marched into Syria and Nubia as conquerors, when Egyptian art and religion set the standard for an entire region, that age had passed. Now Egypt was being shaped, influenced, transformed by currents flowing from Greece and Macedonia, from Rome and the Mediterranean world. And yet, the transformation would take centuries. The ending, when it finally came, would unfold across generations, through the reigns of Greek kings who called themselves pharaohs, through the life of one last remarkable queen, through a final confrontation with an empire larger than anything Egypt had ever known. This is the story of Ptolemaic Egypt, of Alexandria rising on the Mediterranean shore, of scholars gathering in great libraries, of cultures blending in markets and temples, of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, whose intelligence and ambition could not stop what was already in motion. It is the story of how 3,000 years of Pharaonic civilization came to its close, not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow fade into something new. If these quiet journeys through the past help you rest, you're welcome to return any time. When Alexander crossed into Egypt in the autumn of 332 BCE, he was 24 years old and had never lost a battle. He had defeated the Persians at Granicus and Issus. He had besieged Tyre for 7 months until the island city fell. He had marched down the Levantine coast accepting surrenders, establishing garrisons, moving with the inexorable momentum of someone who believed, perhaps correctly, that he was destined for something greater than other men. Egypt's Persian satrap, a man named Mazakas, watched Alexander's approach and made a calculation. The Persian Empire, for all its size and wealth, was fracturing. The great king Darius III had been defeated twice and was retreating eastward. The western provinces were in revolt or already lost. Reinforcements were not coming. Mazatzes commanded a garrison, yes, but not an army large enough to stop Alexander's veterans, hardened by years of continuous campaigning. So he chose pragmatism over futile resistance. When Alexander arrived, at Pelusium, the fortress on Egypt's northeastern frontier, the gates opened without siege. Mazatzes surrendered his authority, his garrison, his responsibility. Egypt, after barely a decade of renewed Persian control, passed to a new master with barely a drop of blood spilled. Alexander moved west along the delta, receiving the submission of cities and officials, until he reached Memphis. The ancient capital greeted him with something approaching celebration. The priests, who had resented Persian oversight and the diversion of temple revenues, saw in this young Macedonian king an opportunity. If he could be persuaded to honor Egyptian traditions, to patronize the temples as the old pharaohs had, then perhaps this change in rulers might actually benefit them. Alexander, for his part, understood the value of symbols. He made sacrifice to Apis, the sacred bull whose cult had been centered in Memphis since time beyond memory. He participated in Egyptian rituals, allowed himself to be presented to the people not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate pharaoh, a successor to the long line stretching back to Narmer and Menes. The priests performed the ancient ceremonies. They spoke the words that had been spoken at coronations for millennia. They placed the double crown on his head, the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of the Delta, unified symbols of a unified kingdom. Whether they believed in the legitimacy of this foreign king or simply recognized political reality is impossible to say with certainty. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps, after so many foreign rulers, the distinction between authentic and expedient had grown blurred. What mattered was that Alexander made the right gestures, honored the right gods, and left the priests feeling that their position had been secured, even strengthened. But Alexander did not linger long in Memphis. He was drawn westward, toward the coast, toward a vision that had formed in his mind during the long march from Macedonia. Egypt needed a new capital, a city that would connect it to the wider Mediterranean world, a port that could handle the trade and communication that linked his growing empire. He found the site on a narrow strip of land between the sea and Lake Mareotis, near a small Egyptian settlement called Rakotis. The location was perfect, defensible, with good harbors, positioned to catch the prevailing winds that drove the ships across the Mediterranean. According to the stories that circulated later, Alexander himself traced the city's outline, marking where the walls would stand, where the main streets would run. When he ran out of chalk, his architects used barley flour. Birds descended and ate the flour, which some interpreted as a bad omen. Alexander's seers reassured him. It meant the city would feed multitudes, Alexandria. The city would bear his name, though he would never see it completed. Within a year he had left Egypt, marching east to continue his conquest of the Persian Empire, to push into lands no Greek had ever reached, to die young in Babylon without ever returning to the Delta. But the city he founded would outlive him by centuries, would become one of the great urban centers of the ancient world, would transform Egypt in ways that even Alexander, for all his vision, probably never imagined. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander made one final journey that would shape his legend and Egypt's future equally. He traveled west across the desert to the oasis of Siwa, where an ancient oracle of Amun had spoken prophecies since before the pyramids were built. The journey took days through barren landscape, and later accounts, embellished, mythologized, told of miraculous guidance, of rain falling in waterless desert, of crows leading the way when the path was lost. What actually happened at Siwa, what the oracle said to Alexander in the sanctuary of the god, remained secret. Alexander never spoke of it publicly. But when he emerged, he carried, himself with a new certainty, made references to his divine parentage, allowed himself to be called son of Amun. The Egyptian priests understood what this meant. Amun was the king of gods, the hidden one, the creator whose name was spoken in every major temple. For Alexander to claim descent from Amun was to claim legitimacy in the most profound Egyptian terms, to assert that his rule was not merely political, but sacred, ordained by the same divine power that had sanctioned every pharaoh since the beginning. Whether Alexander believed this himself or simply understood its political utility is another question without a clear answer. Perhaps both, again. Perhaps in that desert sanctuary, surrounded by priests who spoke of gods and kings and eternal cycles, a young man who had conquered an empire found it easy to believe he was more than merely human. Alexander died in 323 BCE in Babylon, far from Egypt, from Macedonia, from anywhere he might have called home. He was 32. He had conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to India, had founded cities from Egypt to Afghanistan, had changed the political and cultural map of the known world, and he had left no clear heir, no plan for succession, only squabbling generals who immediately began carving up what he had built. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions, a Macedonian nobleman who had fought beside him for years and understood both military strategy and political maneuvering. Ptolemy moved quickly. He claimed Egypt as his province, secured its borders, and made a gesture of enormous symbolic importance. He intercepted Alexander's funeral cortege as it was being transported back to Macedonia and brought the body to Egypt instead. Alexander was buried first in Memphis, later moved to Alexandria, placed in a tomb that became a pilgrimage site, a source of legitimacy for whoever controlled it. To possess Alexander's body was to possess a claim to his legacy, to assert continuity with his vision. Ptolemy understood this instinctively, and he built his rule on that foundation. At first, Ptolemy governed as satrap, nominally subordinate to Alexander's successors in Macedonia. But as the empire fragmented, as Alexander's generals fought each other for supremacy, Ptolemy quietly established Egypt as an independent kingdom. He took the title of Pharaoh, adopting Egyptian royal protocols while maintaining Macedonian and Greek administrative practices. He presented himself to his Greek subjects as a Macedonian king, to his Egyptian subjects as a divine pharaoh, managing the dual identity with skill and pragmatism. He founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last line of pharaohs Egypt would ever know. The Ptolemies were Greek in language, in culture, in outlook. They governed through a Macedonian and Greek elite, appointed Greek officials to key positions, established Greek cities and military colonies throughout Egypt. Alexandria became their capital, a thoroughly Greek city that dominated Egyptian life economically and politically while remaining culturally distinct from the Egyptian hinterland. And yet they also presented themselves as Egyptian pharaohs. They built temples in Egyptian style, commissioned reliefs showing themselves in traditional pharaonic poses, supported the priesthoods, participated in festivals. They understood that Egypt's wealth and stability depended on maintaining the agricultural and religious systems that had sustained the kingdom for millennia. This was a balancing act, a constant negotiation between Greek and Egyptian, between innovation and tradition, between the cosmopolitan Mediterranean world and the ancient rhythms of the Nile Valley. Ptolemy I, later called Soter the Savior, ruled for 40 years, establishing the foundations of Ptolemaic power. He secured Egypt's borders, repelling invasions, maintaining control over Cyrenaica to the west, and extending influence into the Levant and Cyprus. He built up Alexandria, transforming it from Alexander's vision into a living city of libraries and temples, harbors and palaces. He wrote a history of Alexander's campaigns, an account that later historians relied on, shaping how generations would remember the conquests and the king who led them. He understood the power of narrative, of controlling the story, of establishing his own legitimacy through association with Alexander's glory. When he died, he passed the throne to his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, establishing a pattern of dynastic succession that would continue through intrigue and murder, and occasional brilliance until the very end. The Ptolemaic age had begun. Egypt, ancient and enduring, was entering its final chapter, a chapter that would last 300 years, that would see remarkable achievements in scholarship and science, in trade and urban development, in the complex blending of cultures. But it would remain always a chapter in someone else's story. Egypt was no longer the author of its own narrative. It was being written into larger tales of Hellenistic civilization, of Mediterranean commerce, of Rome's rise to dominance. The river still flooded, the temples still stood, the farmers still planted, but the world around them was changing, faster than it ever had before. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as both insiders and outsiders, a paradox they never fully resolved. They were pharaohs who spoke Greek among themselves, kings who wore Egyptian crowns in public ceremonies, but Macedonian dress in their palaces. They married their sisters in the ancient Egyptian royal tradition, yet they governed through systems borrowed from Greek city-states and Macedonian military organization. This duality defined their dynasty from the beginning. Ptolemy I had established the pattern, but it was his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the name means sibling-loving, who refined it into a sustainable system. He ruled for nearly 40 years, from 283 to 246 BCE, and during his reign, Alexandria transformed from a promising new city into one of the great urban centers of the Mediterranean world. Philadelphus understood that power required more than military strength. It required culture, prestige, the kind of soft influence that came from being a center of learning and sophistication. He poured resources into the Library of Alexandria, an institution his father had founded, but that he expanded into something unprecedented. Scholars from across the Greek world were invited to come, offered stipends and housing, given access to scrolls collected from every corner of the known world. The library became a magnet for intellectual life, drawing mathematicians, astronomers, poets, physicians, historians. It was not merely a repository of knowledge, but an active center of scholarship, where texts were copied, compared, edited, where new ideas emerged from the collision of different traditions and perspectives. Philadelphus also sponsored spectacles that advertised Ptolemaic wealth and power to the wider world. The grandest was a procession through Alexandria that lasted an entire day, featuring exotic animals, elephants, leopards, ostriches, imported from deep in Africa. There were floats carrying enormous statues of gods, displays of military equipment, prisoners from conquered territories. Wine flowed from golden vessels. Actors performed in costumes so elaborate they were works of art in themselves. The message was clear. Egypt, under Ptolemaic rule, was wealthy, powerful, connected to distant lands and cultures. It was a kingdom worth courting, worth fearing, worth respecting. The Greek cities around the Mediterranean watched these displays and took note. Egypt might be ancient and foreign, but its rulers spoke Greek, participated in Greek cultural life, and commanded resources that made them major players in the Hellenistic world. Yet this Greek facade concealed, or perhaps overlaid, a very different reality in the Egyptian countryside. In the villages along the Nile, in the small towns of Middle and Upper Egypt, life continued much as it had for centuries. Farmers still worked the same fields their ancestors had worked, using the same tools, following the same agricultural calendar tied to the river's flood. They paid taxes to officials who were now Greek or Macedonian, or Egyptian collaborators who had adopted Greek names and manners. The tax collectors recorded their assessments in Greek instead of Demotic. The grain they produced fed not just Egyptian cities but was shipped across the Mediterranean to Greek islands and mainland ports. But the fundamental relationship between people and land remained unchanged. A farmer in the Fayum, or near Thebes, did not wake thinking of himself as living in a Hellenistic kingdom. He woke to tend his field, to maintain his irrigation channels, to ensure his family would have enough grain to survive the year. The Ptolemies existed for him mainly as a distant administrative presence, the source of tax demands and labor conscriptions, occasionally the sponsor of temple construction that might provide temporary employment. The priests occupied a middle ground between these two worlds. The great temples, Karnak at Thebes, Edfu in the south, Dendera in Middle Egypt, remained wealthy and influential. The Ptolemies, understanding that the priesthoods commanded respect and loyalty that mere military force could not compel, patronized the temples generously. They built new temples or expanded existing ones, commissioning construction in traditional Egyptian architectural styles. The walls of these temples were covered with reliefs showing Ptolemaic kings as Egyptian pharaohs, wearing the traditional regalia, making offerings to Egyptian gods, depicted in the timeless poses that had defined Pharaonic art for 3,000 years. The hieroglyphic inscriptions beside these images named the kings with full Egyptian royal titulature, the 5 names that every pharaoh had carried since the Old Kingdom. The Greeks Ptolemy, Berenice, Arsinoe received Egyptian names, were incorporated into the endless cycles of divine kingship that the priests had maintained since the beginning. In return, the priests supported Ptolemaic rule, legitimized it through ritual and inscription, helped maintain stability in the countryside where their influence remained strong. But the relationship was transactional, pragmatic, not based on genuine cultural unity. The Ptolemaic court in Alexandria spoke Greek, read Greek literature, worshipped Greek gods, though they built temples to them that incorporated Egyptian architectural elements. The Egyptian priests in Thebes spoke Egyptian, maintained Egyptian ritual, worshipped Egyptian gods, though they accepted Greek kings and carved their names in hieroglyphs. Each group needed the other. The Ptolemies needed Egyptian agricultural productivity and the priests' ability to maintain order among the native population. The priests needed Ptolemaic patronage and protection. Yet they remained fundamentally separate. 2 cultures occupying the same territory, interacting constantly but never fully merging. The Ptolemaic family itself became a theater of ambition, intrigue, and violence that would have shocked earlier Egyptian dynasties. Sibling rivalry was not new to Egyptian royalty. The ancient texts recorded struggles for succession, palace conspiracies, usurpations. But the Ptolemies brought a Greek flair for dramatic family conflict, a willingness to murder relatives with a casualness that became their defining characteristic. Brothers killed brothers. Sons deposed fathers. Queens poisoned rivals. The practice of sibling marriage, adopted from Egyptian tradition, meant that spouses were also potential competitors for power, that family gatherings were opportunities for assassination as much as celebration. Ptolemy IV murdered his mother and uncle. Ptolemy VIII killed his nephew, married his nephew's widow, then killed their son. Cleopatra III may have murdered one of her sons and definitely tried to murder the other. The violence became so routine that Greek historians writing about the Ptolemies treated it almost casually, noting murders and coups the way they might note building, projects, or military campaigns. And yet, through all this dynastic chaos, the kingdom itself remained relatively stable. The administrative systems put in place by the early Ptolemies were robust enough to function regardless of who sat on the throne. Tax collection continued. The granaries filled. Trade flowed through Alexandria's harbors. The army maintained order, led by professional officers who served the institution of the monarchy rather than any particular monarch. Egypt's wealth was enormous. The Nile Valley's agricultural productivity, combined with Alexandria's position as a trading hub between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea routes to Arabia and India, generated revenues that kept the kingdom solvent even when the royal family was tearing itself apart. Later, Ptolemies squandered this wealth, debased the currency, allowed administrative corruption to metastasize. But in the early and middle periods of the dynasty, Egypt under the Ptolemies was genuinely prosperous, a major power in the Hellenistic world. One innovation the Ptolemies introduced that would have lasting impact was the deification of their queens. Egyptian tradition had always accorded royal women significant status. Queen's mother, great royal wives, God's wives. But the Ptolemies went further. They worshipped their queens as goddesses, established cults in their honor, built temples where offerings were made to living or recently deceased royal women. Arsinoe II, wife of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, was deified during her lifetime and continued to be worshipped for centuries after her death. Her image appeared on coins. Her cult was established throughout Egypt. Priests served in temples dedicated to her alongside the ancient gods. This practice blended Greek ruler cult, the worship of living kings that had emerged in the Hellenistic world, with Egyptian traditions of divine kingship. It created a new form of religious expression that was neither purely Greek nor purely Egyptian, but something hybrid, something that could only have emerged in Ptolemaic Egypt. The Ptolemaic queens were not merely ceremonial figures or passive symbols. Many wielded real political power, governed as regents for underage sons, led factions at court, commanded armies in some cases. Cleopatra VII ruled jointly with her brother husband and later with her son. Cleopatra III governed Egypt for decades, manipulating succession, eliminating rivals, maintaining her grip on power through intelligence and ruthlessness. The tradition of powerful Egyptian queens, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Nefertari, continued under the Ptolemies, but now inflected with Greek political culture, with the court intrigues of Hellenistic monarchies. These women spoke Greek, read Greek philosophy, corresponded with rulers in Macedonia and Syria and Pergamon. But they also appeared in Egyptian temples as pharaohs, wore the vulture crown of Egyptian queens, were depicted making offerings to Isis and Hathor. They moved between worlds, embodying the dual nature of Ptolemaic rule more completely than their male counterparts often did. As the dynasty progressed, as generations passed, the Ptolemies became increasingly Egyptian in some ways, while remaining resolutely Greek in others. Later, kings still spoke Greek primarily, but some learned to speak Egyptian, a knowledge their predecessors had not bothered to acquire. They continued to build temples in Egyptian style, but now with a sophistication that suggested genuine appreciation rather than mere political calculation. The great temple at Edfu, completed during the reign of Ptolemy III, is one of the best preserved temples in Egypt. Its walls covered with hieroglyphic texts that record rituals and myths, with the same precision as temples built under native Egyptian dynasties. The Ptolemies, who commissioned this temple, may have been Greek in culture and language, but they had become Egyptian enough to understand that the temples mattered, that the rituals mattered, that maintaining these ancient forms was not just a political theater, but something more fundamental. Still, the separation between Greek and Egyptian remained. Alexandria was a Greek city where Egyptian culture appeared mainly as exotic decoration, as mystery cults imported from the old religion, as architectural elements incorporated into Greek buildings. The native Egyptian population lived in their own quarters, spoke their own language, were generally excluded from positions of power. In the countryside, Greek military colonists settled on land grants, creating communities that maintained Greek language and customs while surrounded by Egyptian farmers. These soldiers and their descendants formed the military backbone of the kingdom, but they remained culturally distinct, not integrating with the local population. Egypt under the Ptolemies was a layered society, Greek and Egyptian existing side by side, interacting economically and administratively, but rarely, merging socially or culturally. This created tensions that would eventually contribute to the dynasty's weakening. Native Egyptians sometimes rebelled against Greek rule, particularly in Upper Egypt, where Ptolemaic control was weakest. These revolts were suppressed, but they revealed the limits of Ptolemaic legitimacy. The fact that for many Egyptians, these Greek kings were still foreigners, regardless of how many temples they built or how many hieroglyphs carved their names. The Ptolemaic dynasty would endure for 3 centuries, from Ptolemy I to Cleopatra VII, a span longer than many kingdoms existed at all. During that time, Egypt remained important, wealthy, culturally significant. It was no longer the dominant power it had been during the New Kingdom, but it was far from irrelevant. The dynasty produced scholars and poets, built monuments that still stand, maintained traditions that reached back to the age of pyramids. But it was living on borrowed time, sustained by inherited wealth and geographical advantages rather than genuine political or military strength. The world around Egypt was changing. Rome was rising in the west, crushing Carthage, conquering Greece, extending its power eastward. The Ptolemies watched these developments, tried to navigate them through diplomacy and tribute, through alliances and marriages. They survived longer than the other Hellenistic kingdoms, outlasting the Seleucids in Syria, the Antigonids in Macedonia, the Attalids in Pergamon. But survival was not the same as strength, and by the 1st century BCE, it was becoming clear that Egypt's independence, maintained for so long through adaptation and endurance, was approaching its end. The river still flooded. The temples still stood. But Rome was coming. Alexandria rose where the desert met the sea, a city that belonged fully to neither Egypt nor Greece, but existed in the space between them. It was built on a narrow limestone ridge between the Mediterranean and Lake Mareotis, connected to the mainland by a causeway that created 2 harbors, one facing east toward the Levant, one west toward Libya and Carthage. The location was strategic, chosen for trade and defense, positioned to catch the winds that drove commerce across the ancient world. But Alexandria was more than a port. It became a statement, an argument in stone and marble about what civilization could be when different cultures met and mingled. The city grew quickly. Greek colonists arrived, granted land and tax privileges. Macedonian veterans settled there after their military service. Jewish merchants established a community that would become one of the largest in the diaspora. Egyptians from the Delta came seeking work in the construction projects that seemed to never end. Within a generation, Alexandria was the largest city in Egypt, surpassing even Memphis. Within a century, it was one of the great cities of the Mediterranean world, rivaling Athens and Rome in population, wealth, and cultural influence. The city's layout followed Greek principles, a grid of streets intersecting at right angles, wide avenues lined with colonnades, public spaces designed for gathering and commerce. The main street, the Canopic Way, ran east to west for miles, broad enough for several carts to pass abreast. It was lined with temples and theaters, government buildings and private mansions, shops selling goods from across the known world. Walking this street on a busy morning, one would hear Greek spoken most commonly, but also Egyptian, Aramaic, Latin, languages from Nubia and Arabia and beyond. The crowd would be equally diverse. Greek philosophers in simple cloaks, Egyptian priests in white linen, Jewish scholars, Syrian merchants, Roman diplomats, African traders who had crossed the desert with ivory and gold. The smells were a mixture of incense and fish, perfume and sewage, bread baking, and leather being worked. The sounds were merchants calling their wares, children playing, carts creaking, the constant background noise of urban life in the ancient world. At the city's heart, near the harbor, stood the royal palace complex. It occupied perhaps a quarter of the city's area, a sprawling collection of buildings that housed not just the royal family, but the entire administrative apparatus of the kingdom. There were audience halls where the king received foreign ambassadors, gardens where the court took leisure, treasuries where Egypt's wealth was stored and counted. The palace was off limits to most Alexandrians, a separate world of luxury and intrigue where the fate of the kingdom was decided over wine and whispered conversations, where alliances were forged and broken, where the endless family drama of the Ptolemies played out away from public view. But its presence dominated the city, a constant reminder of where power resided, of whose city this ultimately was. Near the palace stood the most famous institution Alexandria would ever produce, the library. It began as an ambitious royal project, conceived by Ptolemy I and expanded by his successors, intended to collect all the knowledge of the world in one place. Agents were dispatched to cities throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, purchasing scrolls, commissioning copies, sometimes confiscating books from ships that docked in Alexandria's harbor. Every book that entered the city was supposedly copied. The original was kept for the library, the copy returned to its owner. Whether this actually happened consistently is unclear, but the intention was real, to create a universal archive, a repository of everything humans had written and thought worth preserving. The collection grew enormous. Ancient estimates, probably exaggerated, claimed hundreds of thousands of scrolls. More conservative modern assessments suggest perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 individual works, still an astonishing concentration of knowledge. The library was not just storage, but a living institution of scholarship. Scholars came to Alexandria from across the Hellenistic world, drawn by royal patronage and access to this unprecedented collection. They lived in a complex called the Museum, the Temple of the Muses, where they received stipends that freed them from financial worries, where they could devote themselves entirely to study and writing and argument. Euclid taught mathematics there, organizing geometry into the systematic treatise that would shape mathematical education for 2,000 years. Eratosthenes measured the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using the angle of shadows at different locations and geometric reasoning. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, an idea that would be dismissed for centuries before being rediscovered. Callimachus catalogued the library, creating one of the first systematic classification systems. Apollonius studied conic sections. Herophilus and Erasistratus performed dissections, advancing anatomical knowledge beyond anything the Greek world had previously achieved. The poets came too. Callimachus wrote hymns and epigrams. Apollonius Rhodius composed the Argonautica, his epic of Jason and the Golden Fleece. Theocritus invented pastoral poetry, creating an entire literary genre. This scholarship was Greek in language and method, building on traditions that stretched back to Homer and Hesiod, to the pre-Socratic philosophers, to Plato and Aristotle. But it happened in Egypt, supported by Ptolemaic wealth, surrounded by an Egyptian landscape and population. And gradually, inevitably, Egyptian elements began to seep into Greek intellectual life. Greek scholars studied Egyptian mathematics, which had developed sophisticated techniques for surveying and calculation. They examined Egyptian astronomy, learning from observation records that stretched back centuries. They explored Egyptian medicine, which had its own long tradition of anatomical knowledge and pharmaceutical preparation. They were fascinated by Egyptian religion, by the complex theology and elaborate rituals, by gods whose worship predated Greek civilization. Some tried to find correspondences between Greek and Egyptian deities. Others studied hieroglyphics, though none successfully deciphered the script. That would wait another 2,000 years, until the Rosetta Stone and Champollion. The blending of cultures produced new forms of religious expression. The most successful was the cult of Serapis, a god created deliberately, artificially, by the early Ptolemies to bridge Greek and Egyptian traditions. Serapis combined attributes of the Egyptian god Osiris with elements of Greek deities like Zeus and Dionysus. His iconography was Greek, a bearded man in Greek dress, but his mythology drew from Egyptian resurrection themes. His main temple, the Serapeum in Alexandria, became one of the city's most important religious sites. Both Greeks and Egyptians could worship Serapis, each seeing different aspects emphasized, each finding elements familiar from their own traditions. It was religious syncretism as deliberate state policy, an attempt to create shared sacred space in a divided society. The cult succeeded, spreading beyond Egypt to other parts of the Mediterranean world, surviving into the Roman period and beyond. Alexandria's economy rested on trade, on its position as a crossroads between multiple commercial networks. Ships from Greece and Rome brought wine, olive oil, manufactured goods. Ships from the Red Sea ports brought spices and incense from Arabia, silk from distant lands to the east, ivory and gold from deep in Africa. Egyptian grain flowed outward, feeding cities across the Mediterranean. So did papyrus, produced in the Delta, essential for any literate society. Egyptian linen, glass, perfumes, all found markets among wealthy consumers in Athens and Antioch, and eventually Rome. The harbor was constantly busy. Ships arrived and departed on every favorable wind. Stevedores unloaded cargo, their shouts echoing across the waterfront. Customs officials recorded shipments, calculated duties, took their percentage for the royal treasury. Warehouses lined the harbor district, vast buildings where goods were stored while awaiting transport or sale. The smell of spices mixed with salt air, with pitch from ship repairs, with the ever-present fish smell that marked any ancient port city. The city's residents developed a distinct Alexandrian identity, separate from both Greek and Egyptian. They were proud of their city's cosmopolitanism, its intellectual achievements, its wealth and sophistication. They looked down on Egyptians from the countryside as provincial, backwards. They viewed Greeks from the mainland as lacking Alexandria's refinement, stuck in old patterns of thought. This pride sometimes manifested as arrogance. Alexandrians were known for their sharp wit, their love of mockery and satire. They gave mocking nicknames to their kings. Ptolemy VIII was called Physcon, fatty, and composed crude verses about the royal family that circulated in the markets and taverns. The city had its own political life, separate from the royal court. There were Greek civic institutions, assemblies, and councils, though their powers were limited by royal authority. There were guilds for different trades, religious associations, neighborhood organizations. Occasionally, tensions erupted into violence. Greeks and Jews clashed in the streets. Egyptian workers rioted over wages or food prices. The city guard would restore order, sometimes brutally, and life would return to its normal rhythms. For the wealthy, Alexandria offered pleasures and luxuries unknown in most ancient cities. There were public baths fed by aqueducts, gymnasiums where Greek citizens exercised and socialized, theaters where Greek tragedies and comedies were performed. The royal family sponsored games and festivals that brought athletes and performers from across the Hellenistic world. Private dinner parties featured elaborate meals, multiple courses of fish and fowl and meat, seasoned with imported spices, accompanied by wines from the finest Greek vineyards. Conversation ranged across philosophy, literature, politics, the latest gossip about which courtier was rising or falling in royal favor. Wealthy homes were decorated with mosaics and frescoes, furnished with carved wood and bronze, equipped with private libraries of scrolls in expensive cases. For the poor, and there were many poor, as in all ancient cities, life was harder, but perhaps no harder than elsewhere. They lived in multi-story tenement buildings, whole families in single rooms. They worked as laborers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, earning enough to eat, but rarely more. Their entertainment was simpler: street performances, religious festivals, cheap wine in tavern courtyards, gossip exchanged in the markets. But even the poor benefited from living in Alexandria. There were public grain distributions when needed. There was work, more opportunity than in rural villages. There was the excitement of urban life, the sense of being at the center of something important. The lighthouse, the Pharaohs, dominated the city's skyline and imagination. It rose on an island just offshore, connected to the city by a causeway. Ancient sources described it as one of the tallest structures in the world, perhaps 400 feet high, built in 3 tiers that tapered toward the top. A fire burned at its summit at night, visible for miles out to sea, guiding ships safely to harbor. Mirrors reflected the flame's light even further, according to some accounts, though whether this was true or embellished is unclear. The lighthouse was more than practical infrastructure. It was a symbol of Ptolemaic achievement, of Greek engineering applied to Egyptian geography, of Alexandria's role as a beacon, literally and figuratively, for the Mediterranean world. Sailors navigating by its light thought of Alexandria as a place of safety, of wealth, of knowledge. The lighthouse promised haven from the storm. Yet beneath all this achievement, this culture and commerce and learning, there remained a fundamental division. Alexandria was a Greek city built on Egyptian soil, drawing its wealth from Egyptian agriculture, sustained by Egyptian labor. But it was not an Egyptian city. The native Egyptian population was largely excluded from its political life, its cultural institutions, its intellectual achievements. Egyptian peasants grew the grain that fed Alexandrian philosophers. Egyptian craftsmen built the ships that carried Alexandrian trade. Egyptian priests maintained temples that attracted Greek tourists who came to marvel at exotic mysteries. But the city's glory, its libraries and scholars and merchant wealth, belonged primarily to its Greek population. This division would persist throughout the Ptolemaic period, never fully resolved, a source of periodic tension and occasional violence. It was Alexandria's strength, its ability to draw from multiple traditions, and also its weakness, its failure to create genuine unity from diversity. The city endured, brilliant and fractured, cosmopolitan and divided, a monument to both the possibilities and the limitations of cultural encounter. The library scrolls accumulated. The ships came and went. The lighthouse burned through every night. And Egypt, ancient and patient, sustained it all from beneath. She was not supposed to rule. Cleopatra VII was born into a dynasty already in decline, the third daughter of a king the Alexandrians mockingly called Auletes, the flute player, a man whose grip on power was so tenuous he had been driven into exile by his own subjects. The year was 69 BCE, and Egypt, though still wealthy, was no longer independent in any meaningful sense. Rome loomed over everything, a power so vast that the Mediterranean had become, effectively, a Roman lake. The Ptolemies survived by paying tribute, by appealing to Roman politicians, by offering bribes and making promises. Cleopatra grew up in this atmosphere of diminished expectations, in a palace where everyone understood that Egypt's fate would ultimately be decided in Rome, not Alexandria. Yet she would become the most famous of all the Ptolemies, the last pharaoh, a woman whose intelligence and ambition nearly succeeded in preserving Egyptian independence for another generation. Her father regained his throne with Roman help, backed by Roman legions that crushed his opponents and restored him to power. The cost was enormous: debts to Roman creditors, promises to Roman generals, the implicit acknowledgement that Egypt ruled only at Rome's pleasure. When Ptolemy XIII died in 51 BCE, he left the throne to his eldest surviving daughter and his young son, Ptolemy X. Cleopatra was 18. Her brother husband was perhaps 10. Egyptian tradition and Ptolemaic custom both dictated joint rule between royal siblings. But everyone understood that the real power would rest with whoever could command the loyalty of the court, the army, the priesthood. Cleopatra moved quickly to establish herself as the senior partner. She appeared alone on official documents, pushed her brother's name to secondary position, made decisions without consulting the regents who were supposed to advise the young king. She presented herself in Egyptian temples as pharaoh in her own right, wearing the traditional regalia, performing the ancient rituals. This did not sit well with the court faction supporting Ptolemy XIII. Within 3 years, civil war had broken out. Cleopatra was driven from Alexandria by forces loyal to her brother, or rather to the advisers who governed in his name. She fled east toward Syria, gathering supporters and resources, planning her return. She might have remained in exile, might have faded into historical footnote like so many other failed Ptolemaic claimants, except that Rome's own civil war spilled into Egypt at precisely that moment. Pompey the Great, defeated by Julius Caesar at Pharsalus, fled to Egypt seeking refuge with the young pharaoh whose father he had helped restore. Ptolemy Thurn's advisors, calculating that Caesar's favor was worth more than Pompey's friendship, had Pompey murdered as he stepped ashore. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria days later, pursuing his defeated rival, he was presented with Pompey's head. Caesar was furious, not because he had any particular love for Pompey, they had been enemies after all, but because the murder of a Roman consul, even a defeated one, was an insult to Roman dignity, and because Caesar, at age 52, veteran of decades of politics and war, recognized amateur treachery when he saw it. He occupied the royal palace, declared himself arbiter of the Egyptian succession dispute, and summoned both Ptolemy III and Cleopatra to present their cases. Cleopatra, who had been camped east of the Delta with a small army, faced a problem: how to reach Caesar without being intercepted by her brother's forces who controlled Alexandria. The solution became legend. She had herself smuggled into the palace at night, rolled in a carpet or a linen sack, the accounts vary, carried past the guards and presented to Caesar like a gift. Whether this actually happened as described, or whether the story was embellished in later retellings, matters less than what it reveals about Cleopatra's approach to power. She understood theater, understood that dramatic gestures could shift political dynamics in ways that armies sometimes could not. Caesar was captivated, not just by the dramatic entrance, though that surely helped, but by the woman herself. Cleopatra was 21, intelligent, educated in the Alexandrian tradition, fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian, which most of her Greek ancestors had never bothered to learn. She could discuss philosophy and poetry, could debate politics, could charm when needed, and argue forcefully when charm was insufficient. She understood Roman politics better than most Romans, had studied the personalities and rivalries that shaped the Republic's final years. And she needed Caesar, needed his military support to regain her throne, needed his protection against her brother's faction, needed the legitimacy that came from Roman backing. Caesar needed Egypt, too, needed its wealth to pay his debts, needed grain to feed Rome's population, needed a stable client kingdom rather than a fractious mess that might require direct Roman administration. They became lovers. Whether genuine affection was involved or whether it was purely political calculation on both sides, or some combination, is impossible to determine from this distance. Perhaps they themselves could not have said with certainty where politics ended and personal feeling began. What followed was called the Alexandrine War, though it was more palace intrigue than proper war. Ptolemy Thebes' advisors, recognizing that Caesar's support for Cleopatra threatened their position, raised the city against the Romans. Fighting erupted in the streets. The royal fleet was burned in Alexandria's harbor. The fire spread to warehouses along the waterfront, and later sources claimed the library was damaged, though how severely remains disputed. Caesar, with only a small force, held the palace quarter through a winter of sporadic fighting. Reinforcements arrived from Syria in the spring. The decisive battle was fought in the Delta, where Ptolemy XIII's army was crushed. The young king drowned in the Nile, weighed down by his golden armor, trying to flee the battlefield. Cleopatra emerged as the undisputed ruler of Egypt, backed by Roman military might and Caesar's explicit support. She married her younger brother, another Ptolemy, barely 10 years old, continuing the fiction of joint rule while exercising sole authority. She bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, whom she claimed as heir to both Egyptian and Roman power, a claim Rome would never acknowledge but that she maintained nonetheless. For 3 years, Cleopatra ruled Egypt with Caesar's protection. The kingdom's finances stabilized. The administration functioned smoothly. She traveled to Rome at Caesar's invitation, staying in his villa across the Tiber, meeting the Republic's elite, observing Roman politics firsthand. She was there when Caesar was assassinated, on the Ides of March 44 BCE. The senators who killed him claimed they were defending the Republic against tyranny, but they unleashed chaos instead. Another round of civil war, even bloodier than the last, as Caesar's supporters and his assassins fought for control. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, understanding that her position had become more precarious. Caesar's protection was gone. Her son Caesarion had a claim to Roman power that made him either an asset or a liability, depending on which faction ultimately triumphed. She waited, watched, prepared. The Roman world divided between Caesar's heir Octavian, his great-nephew, adopted posthumously, and Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and friend. They crushed the assassins at Philippi, then split the Roman territories between them. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east, including oversight of Rome's client kingdoms in Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in southern Anatolia in 41 BCE. He needed Egyptian resources to fund planned campaigns against Parthia. She needed Roman protection against potential rivals and threats. She arrived in a ship with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by attendants costumed as nymphs and cupids. It was theater again, spectacle designed to impress and intimidate, to establish herself as more than just another client ruler seeking Roman favor. Antony was 42, a career soldier and politician, a man who appreciated grandeur and was susceptible to flattery. He had lived hard, drinking, fighting, loving with the enthusiasm of someone who expected to die young and violently. Cleopatra was 28, experienced now in Roman politics, understanding that her survival depended on choosing the right Roman patron and binding him to her interests. They became allies, lovers, partners in an increasingly ambitious political project. Antony spent the winter in Alexandria. When he returned to Roman territories, Cleopatra accompanied him on campaigns, advised him on strategy, provided resources from Egypt's treasury. She bore him twins, then another son. They were married, though Antony was already married to Octavian's sister in a political alliance that was now complicated beyond repair. The relationship transformed from tactical alliance into something more complex, a genuine partnership, perhaps, though always colored by political necessity. They needed each other in ways that transcended mere convenience. Antony needed Egypt's wealth and Cleopatra's administrative skill. His eastern territories required resources he could not extract from war-exhausted provinces. Egypt, stable and rich, became the foundation of his power base. Cleopatra needed Antony's military strength and his status as one of Rome's 2 most powerful men. With his support, she could expand Egyptian territory, could reclaim lands that had belonged to the Ptolemaic kingdom at its height, could dream of restoring Egypt to genuine independence. They made plans that grew more ambitious, more threatening to Octavian's position in Rome. Antony declared Caesarion the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian's adopted status. He granted Cleopatra and their children territories across the eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus, Cyrenaica, portions of Syria and Anatolia, in a ceremony that looked suspiciously like an attempt to create an independent Eastern Empire. Octavian, cautious and methodical where Antony was impulsive and generous, recognized the threat. He could not allow a rival power base to consolidate in the east, could not permit Antony to create an alternative to Roman authority centered on Alexandria and Egyptian wealth. And he certainly could not allow Caesarion, with his claim to Caesar's legacy, to survive as a potential rival. He began preparing for war, though he framed it carefully, not as civil war between Romans, but as war against Egypt, against the foreign queen who had supposedly bewitched and corrupted Mark Antony. The propaganda campaign was vicious. Cleopatra was portrayed as an oriental seductress, a sorceress who had unmanned a great Roman general. She was accused of planning to rule Rome itself from Alexandria, of threatening Roman values and virtue with Eastern decadence. The reality was more prosaic. Cleopatra was a skilled administrator trying to preserve her kingdom's independence. Antony was a Roman politician pursuing power through methods that differed from Octavian's, but were not fundamentally more threatening to the Republic. But Octavian understood that perception mattered more than reality. By making Cleopatra the enemy, he could rally Roman support without appearing to attack a fellow Roman. The Senate declared war on Egypt in 32 BCE. The decisive battle was fought at Actium, on the western coast of Greece, in 31 BCE. It was primarily a naval engagement, hundreds of ships maneuvering in the narrow gulf, ramming and boarding, fireships spreading flames across the water. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a large fleet, but Octavian's Admiral Agrippa was more skilled, his ships more maneuverable. At the height of the battle, Cleopatra's squadron withdrew, breaking through the engagement and sailing for Egypt. Antony followed her, abandoning his fleet, abandoning the battle. The accounts written by Octavian's supporters claim Cleopatra fled in cowardice, that Antony blindly followed out of infatuation. Later, more sympathetic analyses suggest it was a planned withdrawal when victory became impossible, an attempt to preserve forces for future resistance. Either way, the result was the same. The fleet was destroyed or captured. The army, seeing its commander flee, surrendered. Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, knowing the end was near. Octavian would come with his legions. There was no force in Egypt capable of stopping him, no alliance that could save them. They might delay him for months, perhaps a year, but the outcome was inevitable. They spent that final year in a strange mixture of desperation and celebration. There were feasts and entertainments, philosophical discussions about death, preparations for the defense of Alexandria that everyone knew would fail. When Octavian's army finally arrived in the summer of 30 BCE, resistance collapsed almost immediately. The garrison commanders surrendered. The fleet defected. The city opened its gates. Antony, receiving a false report that Cleopatra had already died, stabbed himself. He survived long enough to be carried to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself, dying in her arms. Cleopatra lived for several more days under house arrest, guarded by Roman soldiers. She negotiated with Octavian, trying to secure safety for her children, trying to preserve some measure of dignity. Octavian offered assurances, but she understood what awaited her: transport to Rome, display in his triumph, humiliation before Roman crowds. She chose death instead. The accounts say she used an asp, a poisonous snake smuggled to her in a basket of figs. The snake became symbolic. The cobra was a symbol of Egyptian royalty, the uraeus worn on the pharaoh's crown. To die by its bite was to die as a pharaoh, to maintain sovereignty even in death. Whether it actually happened that way, or whether she used poison of some other kind, matters less than what the image represented. Cleopatra controlled her own ending, denied Octavian the spectacle of her humiliation. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years, longer than most of her Ptolemaic predecessors. Octavian had Caesarion killed. The boy was 17, old enough to be a threat, young enough to be helpless against Roman power. Cleopatra's other children by Antony were spared, raised in Rome by Octavian's sister, eventually married into Roman aristocratic families, absorbed into the system their mother had tried to resist. Egypt became a Roman province, governed by a prefect appointed directly by Octavian, who would soon take the title Augustus and transform the republic into an empire. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended. The line of pharaohs that stretched back 3 millennia came to its close. The last pharaoh was a Greek woman who had learned to speak Egyptian, who had played the political game with intelligence and courage, who had very nearly succeeded in preserving her kingdom's independence against the greatest military power the world had yet seen. She failed. But it was a failure that would be remembered, debated, mythologized for thousands of years. The river still flowed. The temples still stood. But Egypt would never again be ruled by pharaohs. Egypt became Roman property in the summer of 30 BCE, and Rome treated it differently than any other province. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, declared Egypt his personal possession, a territory that belonged to the emperor rather than to the Senate and people of Rome. No senator could enter Egypt without imperial permission. The province was governed not by a proconsul of senatorial rank, but by a prefect, an equestrian official who answered directly to the emperor. The reason was simple. Egypt was too valuable, too strategic to be entrusted to the usual system of provincial administration. The Nile Valley produced grain that fed Rome itself, vast quantities shipped north every summer to fill the granaries that kept the capital's population docile and content. Control of Egypt meant control of Rome's food supply, which meant control of Rome's political stability. Augustus understood this instinctively. He could not allow Egypt to become a power base for potential rivals, could not risk another general using Egyptian resources to challenge imperial authority as Antony had done. So Egypt was locked down, isolated, administered with a careful efficiency designed to extract maximum revenue with minimum risk. The first Roman prefect arrived in Alexandria with clear instructions. The city's autonomy was curtailed. The Greek civic institutions that had given Alexandria limited self-governance were stripped of real power. The prefect ruled from the palace that had once housed the Ptolemies, making decisions about taxation, justice, administration. The Alexandrian Greeks, proud of their city's cultural achievements and historical importance, resented this diminishment. They had lost the Ptolemaic court, which for all its faults had been a source of patronage and prestige. Now they were governed by a Roman bureaucrat who cared nothing for Greek culture and everything for maintaining order and collecting taxes. Riots erupted periodically, expressions of frustration that were suppressed with efficient violence. Roman legions garrisoned the city, a visible reminder of who held ultimate authority. But the Romans were also pragmatic. They left much of the existing administrative structure intact, understanding that Egypt's complex irrigation systems and tax apparatus required local expertise to function effectively. In the countryside, the transition was more subtle. Egyptian farmers in Middle and Upper Egypt might not have noticed immediate change when news arrived that Cleopatra was dead and Rome now ruled. Their taxes were still collected by local officials, still recorded in the same registers. The grain still went to the same granaries, only now it was shipped to Rome instead of Alexandria. The fundamental relationship between peasant and state remained unchanged. Labor in the fields, a portion surrendered to authority, survival dependent on the Nile's annual flood. Roman rule meant new names in the administrative hierarchy, new languages in official documents. Latin appeared alongside Greek, though Egyptian Demotic continued to be used for local record-keeping. But the routines of agricultural life continued largely unaltered. The temples, however, faced a more complicated adjustment. The Egyptian priesthoods had maintained their influence through centuries of foreign rule by adapting, by incorporating foreign kings into Egyptian religious frameworks, by performing rituals that legitimized occupation in exchange for patronage and protection. The Romans were less interested in these arrangements. Augustus and his successors were willing to be depicted on temple walls as pharaohs, were willing to allow inscriptions that described them in traditional royal titles. But they did not invest the same resources in temple construction or endowments that the Ptolemies had provided. The temples remained wealthy. Their estates were extensive, their accumulated treasures vast. But they began a slow decline that would accelerate over the following centuries. Some Roman emperors showed more interest in Egyptian religion than others. Hadrian visited Egypt in the 2nd century CE, was fascinated by its ancient culture, commissioned temples and statues. But these were exceptions, personal enthusiasms rather than systematic policy. Gradually, imperceptibly, the temple's influence waned. Fewer young men entered the priesthood. The elaborate rituals that had been performed daily for millennia were sometimes abbreviated, sometimes neglected. The knowledge of hieroglyphic writing, already restricted to a small educated elite, became even more specialized, more rare. Yet Egyptian culture proved remarkably resilient under Roman rule. The population remained overwhelmingly Egyptian in language, in custom, in daily practice. They spoke Egyptian, worshipped Egyptian gods, maintained Egyptian burial practices and festivals. Roman cities were established. Antinopolis, founded by Hadrian, was the most prominent. But these remained islands of Roman culture in an Egyptian sea. Veterans of Roman legions were settled on land grants, as Greek soldiers had been under the Ptolemies, but they often assimilated to local culture rather than transforming it. The rural economy continued as it always had. Farming techniques, irrigation methods, the crops planted and harvested all remained essentially Egyptian. Wine production expanded in some regions, responding to Roman demand, but the fundamental agricultural base of wheat and barley persisted. Religion became more complex, more layered, as Egyptian, Greek, and Roman traditions intermingled. The cult of Isis spread throughout the Roman Empire, becoming one of the most popular religions from Britain to Syria. But the Isis worshipped in Rome or Gaul was a Hellenized version, filtered through Greek interpretations, bearing only partial resemblance to the ancient Egyptian goddess. In Egypt itself, old gods continued to receive traditional worship while also being identified with Roman deities. Amun was equated with Jupiter, Thoth with Hermes, Hathor with Venus. These identifications were superficial in many ways, papering over profound differences in theology and practice, but they allowed Egyptian religion to survive, to maintain continuity even as it adapted. The oracle at Siwa, where Alexander had claimed divine sonship, continued to function. The cult of the sacred Apis bull at Memphis persisted, with new bulls being identified and installed with elaborate ceremonies. The festivals, the Opet festival at Thebes, the Sokar festival at Memphis, continued to draw crowds to mark the rhythms of the year. Christianity arrived in Egypt early, tradition claiming that Mark the Evangelist brought it to Alexandria in the 1st century. It spread first among the Greek-speaking population, then increasingly among native Egyptians, offering a new religious framework that seemed less foreign than the Roman state cult, more egalitarian than the hierarchical temple priesthoods. Egyptian Christianity developed its own character, its own theology. The desert became populated with hermits and monks seeking spiritual perfection through isolation and asceticism. Monastic communities formed, creating new kinds of religious life that would influence Christianity throughout the world. By the 4th century, when Constantine made Christianity the favored religion of the empire, Egypt was already largely Christian. The ancient temples were closed by imperial decree. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at Philae, a temple on an island in the Nile near Aswan. After that, the knowledge of how to read and write hieroglyphics died out completely. The sacred script that had recorded Egyptian thought and belief for 3,000 years became indecipherable, mysterious marks on stone that no one could interpret. Yet, even as Christianity replaced the old religion, Egyptian elements persisted. The Coptic Church, the Egyptian Christian tradition, preserved the Egyptian language, adapting the Greek alphabet to write it. Coptic monasticism drew on earlier Egyptian practices of religious devotion. The cult of saints incorporated elements of earlier Egyptian veneration of holy figures. Mary, the mother of Jesus, received devotion in Egypt that echoed earlier worship of Isis and Hathor, the divine mothers and protectors. The Ankh, the ancient Egyptian symbol of life, was adapted into a form of the Christian cross. Egypt remained Egypt, even as it became Christian, even as it became firmly integrated into the Roman Empire. The surface forms changed, the religious framework shifted, but something essential persisted, a continuity of land and people, of language and custom, of ways of seeing and being that no conquest could fully erase. Roman Egypt was prosperous on the whole for its first few centuries. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, meant stable trade routes, protection from external invasion, efficient administration. Alexandria remained one of the empire's great cities, a center of commerce and learning. The grain ships sailed north every summer in vast fleets, feeding Rome and later Constantinople. Egyptian goods, glass, papyrus, textiles, were valued throughout the empire. Egyptian grain sustained not just Rome but military garrisons across the frontier, urban populations in dozens of cities. The wealth flowed outward, extracted through taxation and tribute, but enough remained to maintain basic prosperity. For the landowners and urban merchants, Roman rule brought opportunity. For the peasants, it brought stability, which was perhaps as much as they had ever expected from any government. But empires age. Systems that function smoothly in their prime become rigid, brittle as centuries pass. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was showing strain. Civil wars erupted as generals fought for the imperial throne. The frontiers came under increasing pressure from Germanic tribes in the north, Persians in the east. Inflation eroded the currency. Tax burdens increased as the empire struggled to maintain its military and administrative apparatus. Egypt felt these pressures. tax collection became more aggressive, more exploitative. Peasants abandoned their land, unable to meet the demands placed on them, fleeing to cities or into the desert, where they might escape official notice. The cities themselves grew more troubled. Alexandria experienced periodic riots, clashes between religious factions, ethnic violence between Greeks and Jews and Egyptians. The Roman authorities responded with force, but force could suppress symptoms without addressing causes. The empire split in 395 CE, divided between East and West, between Rome and Constantinople. Egypt became part of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire as it would later be known. Constantinople replaced Rome as the destination for Egyptian grain. Greek replaced Latin as the primary administrative language, though in Egypt Greek had always predominated anyway. The Byzantine period saw Egypt remain important, wealthy, but increasingly peripheral to the empire's concerns. The emperors in Constantinople worried about Persia, about the Balkans, about theological disputes that threatened to fracture Christianity. Egypt provided resources, grain, money, papyrus, but was otherwise left largely to its own devices as long as the taxes arrived and heresies were suppressed. In the 7th century, a new power arose in Arabia. Islam, spreading outward from Mecca and Medina with remarkable speed, conquered the Levant, then turned toward Egypt. The Byzantine garrison, undermanned and demoralized, offered minimal resistance. Alexandria fell in 641 CE. Egypt, after a millennium of Greco-Roman rule, passed to Arab control. This transition marked a more fundamental change than the earlier conquests had. The Arab rulers brought not just a new political system, but a new language, a new religion, a new cultural framework that would eventually transform Egypt more thoroughly than Greek or Roman rule had managed. Over the following centuries, Egypt would become Arabic in language, Islamic in religion, part of a cultural sphere centered on Damascus and Baghdad and Cairo rather than on the Mediterranean or Constantinople. The Old Egypt, Pharaonic Egypt, Christian Egypt became increasingly remote, remembered in monuments that no one could read, in ruins that testified to a past no longer fully understood. Yet even this was not complete erasure. The Coptic Christians preserved elements of ancient Egyptian language and culture. The fellahin, the peasant farmers, maintained agricultural practices that stretched back millennia. The Nile still flooded, though less reliably as upstream irrigation changed its patterns, and the land still greened. The temples stood, weathered and crumbling, hieroglyphics mute on their walls. The pyramids endured, massive and mysterious, inspiring awe in every generation that saw them. Egypt's landscape remained recognizable. Someone from the age of the pyramids, transported forward 3,000 years to the Arab conquest, would have found much that was familiar: the river's course, the pattern of fields and desert, the rhythm of seasons. The particulars had changed. The gods were different. The language in the streets was different. The structures of power and authority were different. But the land endured, and the people endured, carrying forward fragments of the ancient past even as they adapted to each new present. The end of Pharaonic Egypt was not a single moment but a gradual fading. It ended when Cleopatra died and Augustus claimed Egypt as Roman property. It ended when the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae. It ended when the last priest who could read the ancient texts died without teaching another. It ended when Christianity replaced the old gods, when Arabic replaced Greek and Coptic, when Islamic culture transformed the framework of daily life. Or perhaps it never ended completely. Perhaps something essential persisted through all these transformations, carried in the soil and the river, in the rhythm of agricultural life, in the monuments that refused to crumble entirely into dust. The pharaohs were gone. The double crown would never be worn again. The divine kingship that had defined Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years had passed into history. But Egypt remained. Different, transformed, layered with new cultures and new meanings. And the river still flowed, as it always had, carrying memory in its waters, 3,000 years. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to truly comprehend that span of time. Longer than all of recorded history from the fall of Rome to the present day. Longer than Christianity has existed. Longer than any empire, any language, any continuous political system known to the modern world. And yet that is how long Pharaonic Egypt endured, from the unification under Narmer around 3100 BCE to Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE. 30 centuries during which the same river flooded each year, during which the same gods received offerings, during which kings claimed the same divine authority and built monuments meant to last forever. Some of those monuments still stand. When we think of Egypt's legacy, we think first of what remains visible, the pyramids at Giza, the temples at Karnak and Luxor, the Valley of the Kings with its painted tombs. These are what survive most obviously, what tourists visit, what photographs capture. But Egypt's legacy runs deeper than stone and gold. The ancient Egyptians developed one of the first writing systems, hieroglyphics that evolved into hieratic and demotic scripts, preserving knowledge, recording history, allowing culture to accumulate across generations. When that knowledge was finally lost, when the last person who could read hieroglyphics died, humanity lost access to 3,000 years of Egyptian thought and literature. It took another 14 centuries before Champollion, working with the Rosetta Stone, finally unlocked the script again. And even now, much remains untranslated, understudied, waiting in museum collections and archaeological sites for scholars who may never have sufficient time or resources. Egypt contributed to mathematics, to geometry, and calculation, developing techniques for surveying and construction that allowed the building of monuments we still cannot fully replicate with modern technology. They advanced medicine, creating texts on anatomy and surgery, on diagnosis and treatment, mixing effective remedies with magical spells, but demonstrating an empirical approach to understanding the human body. They developed sophisticated astronomy, tracking the movements of stars and planets, creating calendars that divided the year into seasons and months with remarkable accuracy. They created art that influenced Greek sculpture, that shaped Hellenistic aesthetics, that continues to inspire artists and designers thousands of years after the last pharaoh. Their religious concepts, ideas about the afterlife, about divine judgment, about the soul's journey after death, influenced later traditions, including Christianity and Islam, though the specific connections are complex and often debated. But perhaps Egypt's deepest legacy is something less tangible. It is the proof that human civilization can endure, can maintain continuity across timescales that make individual lives seem vanishingly brief. The scribe who copied texts in the Middle Kingdom was preserving knowledge from the Old Kingdom, already 1,000 years in his past. The priests of the Ptolemaic period performed rituals that had been established before the pyramids were built. This sense of connection to the past, of participating in something larger and longer than oneself, shaped Egyptian culture profoundly. It created a civilization that valued continuity over innovation, that measured success not in conquest or expansion, but in maintaining Ma'at, the eternal order that had existed since creation. When that civilization finally ended, when the last pharaoh died and Rome took control, something irreplaceable was lost. Not just political independence, but a way of understanding time, of relating present to past, of imagining eternity. The Egypt that exists today is the product of all the layers that came after: Roman and Byzantine, Christian and Islamic, Ottoman and modern. It is a living culture, not a museum, with its own vitality and challenges and future. But somewhere beneath all those layers, the ancient past persists. The Nile still flows, though the Aswan Dam has changed its rhythms. The pyramids still rise from the desert, weathered but standing. The temples, many of them, still bear their ancient inscriptions, still speak to anyone willing to learn their language. And, perhaps more importantly, the idea of Egypt endures, in collective memory, in imagination, in the human fascination with civilizations that achieved greatness and then passed away. We study ancient Egypt not just to understand the past, but to understand what human beings are capable of creating, of maintaining, of passing forward across generations. We study it to remember that our own civilizations, however permanent they seem, are also temporary, are also building on foundations that will outlast us. If you have stayed with this story through all its chapters, through dynasties and conquests, through the slow rise and gradual fall of Pharaonic civilization, then you have walked with generations who planted and built and worshipped and died, who raised children and copied texts and carved stone, who participated in something larger than themselves without ever fully understanding its scope. You have seen Egypt at its height, building monuments that touched the sky, expanding its borders through military might and diplomatic skill. You have seen it fragment and reunify, endure occupation and foreign rule, adapt and persist through changes that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. You have seen it finally pass into history, transformed beyond recognition yet still somehow itself, still Egypt. The journey ends here, at the point where Pharaonic civilization gives way to something new. But endings are never absolute. The past continues in the present, in ways both visible and hidden, in monuments and memories and the accumulated weight of all that came before. Rest now. The story is complete, though the river flows on, and the stones remember, and somewhere in the accumulated dust of centuries, Egypt endures.